Good morning. My name is Janessa Dixon, and I have been attending Hope for about 4 years. Please stand for today's reading. The passage today is Luke 17, 7 through 10. Will any of you who has a servant plowing or keeping sheep say to him when he has come in from the field, "Come at once and recline at table"? Will he not rather say to him, "Prepare supper for me and dress properly, and serve me while I eat and drink, and afterward you will eat and drink"? Does he thank the servant because he did what was commanded? So you also, when you have done all that you were commanded, say, "We are unworthy servants. We have only done what was our duty." This is the word of the Lord.
You may be seated. Good morning. It's great to see you. Thank you for being here and joining us on your start of the 4th of July week. We are so glad that you are here. Next week, we will recognize that time together. I will talk about freedom, as I'm excited to teach from the parable of the prodigal son, and we're going to talk about that of misused freedom and realized freedom, and I'm looking forward to talking with you next Sunday morning. So we continue in our series, The Parables of Jesus, our summer series. Today is part 6, so we have done 6 parables together. Today, the unworthy servant, maybe a parable that you have not heard in a while. We're excited about sharing it with you this morning. So we desire to answer for you 2 questions, 2, I think, very pointed questions. The first is this: what is my obligation as a disciple of Jesus? What is my obligation as a disciple of Jesus? You say, well, Mark, if you're going to give away prizes, then I know what that is, and that is that we are to love the Lord our God with all of our heart and our soul and our mind and our strength, and our neighbor as ourselves. Well, that's great. Yes, that kind of answers that question. But then the second question, I think, is a little more difficult, and that is that what attitude, everybody say the word attitude for me for a moment. Attitude is important, right? What attitude should I have as a disciple of Jesus as I serve him? Attitude, position. What attitude should I have as a disciple of Jesus as I serve him? Now, I think it's important to frame the parable that Janessa just read for us. It is spoken by Jesus, not to a group of individuals gathered on a hill, or yet a group of individuals gathered in a pasture somewhere who are expecting lunch from a little boy's loaves and fishes. It's not that at all, and I'm not discounting any of that, but specifically it is spoken to his disciples, followers of Jesus it is. I love to quote Spurgeon for you, Charles Spurgeon. So I found a great quote from one of his sermons, actually, as he preaches on this parable, spoken in 1889. And it says this: mark you. Well, it's an old English statement. It kind of says to take note is what it means of this. It says, mark you, he was not laying down the way of salvation, but pointing out and I underline this point, pointing out a path of service. That is important. Pointing out a path of service for those who were already saved. I think it's a powerful thought to go back to that second question for a moment. What attitude should I have as a disciple of Jesus as I serve him? So to give you some context of the parable this morning of the unworthy servant, let me start in Luke chapter 17, verse 1, and we'll work our way down to the parable this morning. So let me read to you. And he said to his disciples, speaking of Jesus, "Temptations to sin are sure to come, but woe to the one through whom they come. It would be better for him if a millstone was hung around his neck and he were cast into the sea than that he should cause one of my little ones to sin." Pay attention to yourselves. I underline that statement. I think it's very powerful and thought-invoking. Pay attention to yourselves. If your brother sins, rebuke him. If he repents, forgive him. And if he sins against you 7 times in the day and turns to you 7 times saying, "I repent," you must, forgive him. Getting choked up on all the forgiveness stuff, right? Yes, it kind of gets you. Understand, Jesus is talking about something that we struggle with at times in our life. So here's the first thought this morning as we begin our study together. Our faith is not a private faith. That our faith is not a private faith. In fact, it is a very public faith. It matters how we live. Realize this. It matters how we live and relate to one another. Even the laws of our land, our laws of our community dictate this, that I can't treat you just any way that I want to treat you. And if I do mistreat you, then there are consequences to that kind of treatment. But these words of Jesus are not centered around a law of our community, but they're centered around what God says to you as Christ followers. It's how we should live. As a Christian, it matters how we live. Just get that into your heart this morning as we work into this study. As a Christian, it matters how you live. But I want to say something before you kind of go crazy with that thought for a moment, that how I live does not save me. Get that down, okay? This is not about works. How I live does not save me, but it is the proof of my salvation. Wow, it is. That's powerful. Especially in the area that Jesus is talking about, in this area of influence and forgiveness. That it is a powerful proof of my salvation, specifically in this area. It matters greatly to God how I live, because my life is not my own business. My faith is a very public faith. That is the point that he shares with his followers. That's why Jesus begins to build context for you and I before he gets to the parable that Janessa read to us earlier. For you to really grasp what he's going to say in the parable, then you have to get a good working knowledge of all of this stuff before. That my life is not my own business. I think we live in a culture sometimes where it says to us, hey, you do you and I'll do me and life will be okay, right? Everything will be good if you do you and I'll do me, and everybody is kind of happy. I want to tell you something. That is not a teaching of Jesus, and that is not biblical at all. That's not what he's saying. In fact, he took the time to say these words to you and I. Pay attention to yourselves is what he says. Pay attention to yourselves. He's saying this to his followers. What he's saying to them, and I think this is heavy, that you will assume the burden of living this kind of lifestyle is what he's saying. Specifically, what he's saying is this lifestyle of influence and that of forgiveness, that you will assume, if you follow me, this burden of living this kind of lifestyle. You say, but Mark, wait a minute. He talks about me offending others and causing others to sin. And so, there are some people in life, Mark, that just are offended at everything, right? And if you know that person, and if they by chance are sitting next to you, don't look at them right now. Look at me, right? Because if you look at them, they will be what? Offended, correct? Yes. So no. And I would say to those of you in the room that are easily offended, I love you. And if you don't know me, well, just take that for what it is. I do. But if you are constantly being offended about everything that goes on around you and everything people says to you, then I want to tell you something. Something inside of you needs to die. And let me tell you what this is. It is your flesh. Wow. That'll influence people and win friends, won't it? Yes, but it's true. Yes. It is so true. But that's not what Jesus is talking about. No. He's talking about living a life that you are aware of what you do, and you're aware and careful not to cause people around you to sin. But he's not talking about you living in the bondage of other people's opinions about you. That's a whole different other discussion. But this lifestyle that Jesus is talking about here is not easy by any means. We realize that. I think it's almost seems to be impossible what he talks about here outside of that of the power of God working in our lives and being resident within our lives. The disciples realize that. They feel the weight of the obligation, the duty that Jesus is talking about to live this kind of lifestyle as his followers, because understand this. These things that Jesus have just said to us, they are not suggestions. They are not good ideas, perhaps, for you to give some thought to. They are obligations as a Christ follower. Wow. Now you wish you had left for 4th of July vacation sooner, right? No, they are obligations as followers of Christ. And the disciples feel the weight of that. So they say to Jesus in verse 5, the apostles said to the Lord, increase our faith, is what they said to Jesus. And the Lord said, if you had faith like a grain of mustard seed, you could say to this mulberry bush or tree, is the correct interpretation, tree, be uprooted and planted in the sea, and it would obey you. They say to him, increase our faith. I love the disciples because what they're saying is, Jesus, we know who you are, that you are the incarnate Christ, fully God, fully man. This is your thing. This is not possible for us in our flesh and in our humanity. They're speaking out of the weakness of their humanity. But I thought about these two verses. How often have you and I heard them preached or taught or used in a conversation outside of the context in which Jesus gave them? Now, I'm not saying that they don't apply to other areas of your life spiritually, but I think if you're going to preach them in the pure context of Jesus' words, then what he's saying, he's talking about faith to live a life that is concerned about our influence on others and the forgiveness of others as well, is what he's saying. It's about relationships. Well, Mark, I like to use that verse when I'm planning, to buy a new car or something. I think it works better for that. Listen, I don't know. I'm not going to scold you on that this morning, but what I'm going to say is this: context is everything. And if you look at it in context, it's written about that of living a lifestyle that God, I'm going to use the word, demands of you and I, is what it's about. A life of influence and forgiveness. So here's the thing. Sandwiched between that of a teaching from Jesus on influence and forgiveness, and then that of the unworthy servant, he puts right in the middle, he talks to us about faith and where we place our faith. It is amazing because the disciples feel the weight of all of this, so they ask him, increase. Well, I thought, what is the word that's used there? And it simply means to add to. They're not denying that they don't have faith. They're just saying to Jesus, we don't have enough faith to live this kind of relationship type of lifestyle that you're calling us to live, Jesus. So add to the faith that we have, is what he's saying. So they said, add to, in the shadow of this requirement that you're giving us. And then Jesus said, well, then have faith like a grain of mustard seed. So I studied this verse for quite a while. I thought this through. I've heard it preached so many times being raised in church. If this is your first time hearing it, then I'm so glad that you're here. And I hope that you go and do some study and reading on your own in this. But he said, faith like a grain of mustard seed. And all of a sudden what I realized is this, that Jesus is fully God. He's fully man. He discerns the heart of his disciples. And what he finds as he's examining their heart, he finds the state of their faith. And their faith is the size of mustard seeds. Have you ever seen a mustard seed? It's very small, isn't it? And here's what Jesus is saying to them in these two verses, though. He's saying, hey, you can accomplish this with what you already have, is what he's saying. Because the deal here, it's not the amount of the faith that you have, but it's in whom your faith lies that makes the difference. He knows their faith. He discerns their very hearts. He calls it as he sees it. And he says their faith is like the faith of a mustard seed, is what he says. He's exactly. He doesn't just pull that analogy out of his imagination. It's their faith. But here's the interesting thing. It's enough when positioned in him. What he's saying is, hey, this lifestyle that you think is absolutely impossible for you to live, a lifestyle of influence about others around you, a lifestyle where you are very considerate and thoughtful of your ways and aware of your ways, a lifestyle where you can forgive, not just forgive once a year or twice a year, but your forgiveness bank is unlimited. That kind of lifestyle is absolutely possible for you because it's not simply built on the amount of faith that you have, but it's simply the faith that you already have positioned in the right place, and that's on me, he says. It's not the portion of faith, but the positioning of your faith. So I thought about a text that Paul writes in the book of 2 Corinthians. Paul's talking about what we know to be called the thorn in the flesh for him. It is something that continually plagues Paul. He asks God to remove it. God does not remove it. And he says in 2 Corinthians 12:9, but he said to me, he's saying what God told him. He's saying, but God said to me, my grace is sufficient for you. He said that to Paul. For my power is made perfect in weakness. Because it's not the amount of faith that we have. It's how we position our faith. Therefore, I will boast in all the more gladly of my weaknesses, Paul says, so that the power of Christ may rest upon me. Wow. I found a Tim Keller quote this week, and I want to share it with you. It just goes so well with this. He says, it's not the strength of your faith, but the object of your faith that actually saves you. But this is the part I like. He says, strong faith in a weak branch is fatally inferior. Let me read it again. Strong faith in a weak branch is fatally inferior to weak faith in a strong branch. Wow. Jesus, I can't forgive 490 times, right? Well, we know that's from another gospel where Jesus says that you must forgive 70 times 7, 490. If you happen to be the 491st person, then you're in trouble, right? Yes, you're out. I mean, you're not going to get it. That's for sure. That's not what he's talking about. Here's what he's talking about in this text and that as well. He says, if you place your faith in me, not you and your own ability to live this kind of life, but if your faith is placed in me and your trust is placed in me, you can not just forgive 490 times, but that you can forgive without limits is what he's saying. Does that make sense? When your faith is positioned in me, you can forgive without limits. You can already hear the beeping of the dump truck of guilt backing up to your life, can't you? Yeah. And it's about to really just open up and flood on you. Now, just stay with us for just a moment through this teaching. You see, Jesus knows how difficult these areas of Christian life are for you and I. He realizes that. So then he uses this example or this analogy of saying that you can say this to, or you can say to this mulberry tree, he says. He uses that as an example in those two verses. He understands the difficulty of it. What do you mean, Mark? Well, this mulberry tree, known as many times as the fig mulberry, I don't know if you're ever on Jeopardy, these are great things, right? Or a sycamore tree, the same thing. It's a sycamore tree. So I thought about a sycamore tree, and I thought about, well, it was strong enough to hold a tax collector in Luke chapter 19, that perhaps there's something I need to understand about this tree, right? When you hear a sycamore tree and you associate it with the Bible, who do you think about? Who do you think about? Zacchaeus, right? Yes. Zacchaeus was a wee little man was he. Mark, don't do that because that's a mind worm. It gets in your brain, right? Yes. And then it's all day long. It's going to be like, oh, why did he say that? No. Yes. So Jesus purposely chooses this tree for you and I. Why? Because it's a tree that's not just grown for its fruit, but it's known for its tenacity to withstand elements. Yes, you just don't walk up and pull a mulberry tree from the ground. It just doesn't happen. It's not like pulling a weed from your garden or your flower bed. It has deep roots. It has strong branches, strong enough to hold a tax collector that's looking for Jesus. Such a tree that Jesus would use for you to see the absurdity and the difficulty of this act and this lifestyle outside of him. Is to jar you and I today as we hear this text this morning, that your weak faith, the size of a mustard seed, positioned in the proper place, and that is him, results in the impossible becoming possible in your life, that you can live a lifestyle that is pleasing to God. You can fulfill these obligations, these duties, not within yourself, not on your own ability, only when you place your faith solely and truly in him. Wow. But then I geeked out more about this thing, right? And I said, Mark, you haven't even got to the parable yet. And it's been 19 minutes and 12 seconds. I know, I'm getting there. Don't push me, okay? So here's the thing. But I love this text about faith. He said, be rooted, or he said, then what you're going to say to the mulberry tree is, be uprooted and be planted in the sea. But I was astounded by the next words. He said, and it would obey you. It's almost as if he's saying that the tree is waiting for the command. I love this thought as well, that the results are assured. Yes, you say, Mark, I can't move on from this situation in my life. I can't forgive, or they won't forgive me, and I can't get away from this at all. Here's what Jesus is saying to you and I when we struggle with this kind of life: mustard seed faith, planted deep in the soil of the Savior, moves what seems to be unmovable. Wow. Now we get to the parable, right? Because Jesus had to lay the foundation for you and I to grasp what he is about to say to us. Verse 7, will any one of you who has a servant, and he uses the term a servant, underline that, that's important, plowing or keeping sheep, say to him when he has come in from the field, come at once and recline at table. Will he not rather say to him, prepare dinner for me, dress properly, serve me while I eat and drink, and afterwards you will eat and drink? And some of you feel the frustration with this text already, like I don't understand what Jesus is saying, and that is cruel, and that's rude somewhat. Oh, it gets the rudeness. Oh, here's more, right? Does he thank the servant because he did what he was commanded? Really? So you also, when you have done all that you were commanded, say, we are unworthy servants. We have only done what was our duty. So here's the thought. The 4-letter word duty. Oh, Mark, don't you know what a 4-letter word is? It's a word that's offensive at times. Yes, I realize that. And this word, when we take this word duty and we bring it into our Christian life and our lifestyle and our relationship with God, and we insert the word duty in all of that, wow. So, Mark, there must be a translation issue here. There must be. Well, I checked it for you just to kind of solve your curiosity. The Greek word is debio, and debio simply means, you want to hear what it means? It means I owe, or it means I ought, or it also means I'm obligated. Well, I guess that kind of settles it, doesn't it? A servant, he says. Well, I just can't believe that Jesus would use that term, because my translation even uses the word slave as well. So I just can't believe that Jesus would talk about this and use this kind of word. And I think that immediately what we do, especially as Americans, I think, is we frame this text in that understanding of slavery and how you and I understand or attempt to wrap our minds around that of slavery in America as well. This dark and sinful mark on our nation's history. Slavery in America was about race. It was race-based, absolutely. It was about the dehumanization. There's the word, that's it, right? Yeah, I knew it would come out in a moment, of that particular race, that it took African people and descendants of African people against their will, brought them here and sold them like livestock, and many times treated them worse than they would treat their own animals. Can I tell you, it was sin, it's sin today, it was sin then, and it will always be sin. Always. But that's not what Jesus is talking about. I want to frame this for you correctly for you to have an understanding of what he's dealing with and this parable. This servant in this parable is he's an indentured servant. He's a bond servant is what he is. It doesn't change the point of duty for you and I, duty and that of obligation. But what it does, it gives us a very good cultural context in why he would say this to his disciples that day. This is an indentured servant or a bond servant. Let me explain it to you. Indentured servitude means that this servant owed the farmer a debt. The farmer was his creditor, and this servant could not pay the creditor. And in this culture, there was no such thing as bankruptcy. So to satisfy the debt, the debtor, which is the servant, becomes the farmer, which is the creditor's servant, is what happens. But I want to spend another moment here to kind of flesh this out for you. In American slavery, the owner owned both the person and the person's labor, so that owner could abuse the slave, take their life, do whatever they wanted to do. There was no question of their authority over their slave, because that slave of theirs was treated less than property many times. In this parable, though, indentured servitude is where the farmer owns the labor of the debtor, but not the person in the place of abusing the debtor. You say, well, that doesn't make it any better, really. And I realize that, and I understand that as well. But I think it gives us a cultural context to work from that the disciples would have understood, because Jesus always meets us right where we are in the moments of our mustard seed faith, because all of them would have understood someone who had perhaps had to file bankruptcy, and the way they did it in that culture was indentured servitude. That person no longer belongs to themselves, but to their creditor, the farmer, in whom they are indebted. Let me give you a point. You say, Mark, that was a lot. So what's the point of all of this? Jesus first talks to his disciples about unlimited forgiveness. And then the disciples express their need for greater faith to accomplish that obligation. Then Jesus gives this parable of the farmer and the unworthy servant. Why? Because here's the point. When you come to Christ, you are no longer your own. Realize that. You are no longer your own. Just as servants, you are his. Not for the purpose of abuse like a slave, but yet you are his. So what does that mean for me in my life, Mark? Well, let me tell you. Take your left hand and reach down and grab one portion of that seat belt, your right hand. You guys didn't know we had seat belts in the pews, right? And buckle it up and tighten it up, because here's what this means. The option to mistreat your brother or your sister, to cause them to stumble, to harbor forgiveness and bitterness, is no longer on the table for your life. The option is not there. You are a servant of Christ. You no longer belong to yourself, but you belong to him. Mark, the dump truck of guilt is no longer backing up. It is like just opening up right now, and I'm about to drown. No, let me say this to you and hear this well this morning. I'm not saying that you're no longer going to struggle with these issues of unforgiveness. I'm not saying that you're no longer going to struggle with areas at times of fighting against bitterness in your life. That's not what I'm saying. But I think the key word here is struggle. Are you struggling with those things? Are you struggling with them? You see, the journey with God for us is much more like a crock pot than it is a microwave. That's good theology. I don't know if you know that or not. I've said it to you many times, but it is. It's a journey. It's a dirt road journey of sanctification for you and I. It matters how we live, because it is our duty, our obligation. After all, we don't belong to ourselves. 1 Corinthians chapter 6. Or do you not know that your body is a temple of the Holy Spirit within you, whom you have from God? You are not your own. You're not your own, for you were bought with a price. So glorify God in your body. You're not your own. That you were bought with a price is what that Paul is saying to you and I. When you put all this together, the catalyst of my obedience to God, the catalyst for me living this kind of lifestyle which is pleasing to God in the area of influence and forgiveness, the catalyst behind all of that, the fuel for all of that is this overwhelming understanding that we were bought with a price. It is the gospel. It is the love of God, the redemptive work of God that we will celebrate in a moment at the Lord's table together. It is the love of God, the redemptive work of the cross, the greatest act of love ever shown to mankind and humankind. Love is the catalyst for my obedience to my duty as I follow Christ. I forgive because I've been forgiven. I serve because I was first served by him. He owes me nothing. I owe him everything. I am lovingly obligated as his follower. Wow. This is why duty is a 4-letter word. Can you see it? Yes. We struggle with bringing that into our relationship with God, but Jesus purposely uses the word. It is there. I can't take it out. It's there. So let me give you 2 things quickly before we go to the Lord's table this morning. Well, I said quickly. I don't know if that really is true or not, right? But we'll see how that goes, right? So let me give you 2 things this morning about this obligation to God, this lifestyle that God has called us to. The first is as a servant. They both begin just simply with that. As a servant, I live knowing that God owes me nothing. I live knowing that God owes me nothing. Listen, as a servant, God does not employ me. I am not an employee of God. Realize that. He does not pay me when I do a good job and then simply fires me when I work as a substandard. No, everything I have is a gift from God this morning. Understand that. So here's what I would say to you this morning. Release the idea that God owes you. Release the idea that God owes you. God does not owe you an apology. Boy, this is getting heavy, and I realize that. But these are the words of Jesus, and this is this small parable for you and I. Release the idea that God owes you. You're the servant. Whatever you have this morning, whatever you have in your life is due to his character and nature as a loving and a merciful God for you. Understand that God owes you absolutely nothing. You're not working for his love. You're not working for a manager's position in his company at all. You're his child. He is your perfect father. But Mark, I deserve this. No, let me tell you what you deserve and what I deserve. We deserved death. Jesus steps into the middle of our mess and he becomes our Savior and he redeems us on the cross and he saves you and I. Understand that everything that we have, life, breath, everything in this world is a gift from God. And as a servant, then I'm convinced that God owes me nothing. It's why when you read the parable, when the servant comes in from out of the field and he's been working all day or he's been tending sheep and then he goes and prepares a meal for the farmer and he changes his clothes and he waits on him and he serves him and then he eats. Realize this, no, he never reminds the farmer of his rights as a bondservant because everything in his life is held by that farmer. Understand this, God doesn't owe us anything. The farmer could have taken him to debtor's court. He could have done that. He could have put him in prison until this was all paid. That's Matthew chapter 18, if you want to read it as well. No, but the farmer chose to place him in the field where he could work off his debt. He made a way of escape. God does not owe me. I wrote in my journal this week, God does not, and just give me some latitude for a moment. If you have a book or if you heard this or whatever, but God does not owe me my best life. Wow. And if you live like that, and if you live like God owes you something, then when life goes south, then when things don't work out for you, when you're not having your best day, then that affects your relationship with God, doesn't it? It does, yes. When things don't go your way or there's loss or some other thing happens in your life, then you connect that to God. Well, God is not good because God is not functioning the way I want God to function in my life. No, God does not owe us those things. And anything that we get from God is an amazing gift from Him. And to grasp that is what it means to be Christian. I would challenge your understanding of redemption this morning. If you're living that way, that if God owes you something, I would challenge your understanding of the redemptive work of God in your life. The second thing is that as a servant, it's my duty to obediently follow all. Everybody say the word all. Could you say it with me? All? All of them, right? All of God's commands, not just the ones that make me comfortable. Wow. That's why Jesus frames this whole parable in that framework of a servant. A servant never refuses his Lord. It's why Jesus starts this chapter with forgiveness. Why? Because it's one of the most difficult things that you and I deal with in this lifestyle, this Christian lifestyle, of that influence and forgiveness. That's where he starts. It's a struggle for us at times in our life because as Christians, we have obligations regardless of how we feel and the consequences. For many years, I think for some of us, when we bring the word duty into our walk with God, it's truly like a four-letter word. And when I see what Jesus is teaching us in this parable, as he's built out context for us to understand this morning, that yes, as a follower of Christ, then I have obligations and duty with him, fueled by his love and his redemptive power in my life, but yet that is still what it is. We are unworthy servants. We have only done what was our duty. Being a follower of Jesus is far more than being a servant. Yes, I agree with that 100%. It is. Yes, but it is not less than being a servant. Can I share with you a text before we go to the Lord's table together? It's John 15:15. I think it just kind of sums this up for you and I about this statement of being a follower of Jesus is far more than being a servant, but not less. John 15 says, no longer, the words of Jesus, do I call you servants, Jesus says. No longer do I call you servants. For the servant does not know what his master is doing. Say thank you, Mark, for sharing that for the end. We appreciate that, right? That just makes us, now we love you again. But just listen to what it says. Does not know what his master is doing, but I have called you friends, for all that I have heard from my Father, I have made known to you. You did not choose me, but I chose you and appointed you that you should go and bear fruit, and your fruit should abide, so that whatever you ask the Father in my name, he will give you. So, Mark, I'm a bit confused. We have a parable on servants, and we're servants, but now Jesus doesn't call us that. This text doesn't and never was meant to erase the fact that we are his servants and there is duty and obligation in this lifestyle with him, but it frames it properly for us that he would call us friends. Because our service is not a demeaning and abusive service like that of a slave, but that's why Jesus chose to write this and give this parable in the framework of a bondservant. Do you see that? It's service, yes, but it's service of joy because God calls you friend. He chose you. You didn't choose him. So what that says to me, and I hope to you, is God has this. God has this. I wrote in my journal this week, serve in joy and rest in his sovereignty. Serve in joy, rest in his sovereignty. So perhaps at some moment or even today in your own life, you've had this moment where you have said to God, I can't live this life, right? I can't do all these things that you have called God duty or obligation. And I will tell you that your statement is partially true. That you can't live this life of influence and unlimited forgiveness outside of placing your trust and faith, as small as it is and weak as it is, in him. You see, the enemy will tell you that it's futile, it's absolutely a waste of your time, and it's just not going to happen. And then the enemy begins to remind you of all the times that you failed here, right? He begins to give you a list of all the failures of this, trying to live this lifestyle that God has called you to live. And he reminds you of all of that. Why? Because he knows the truth. That if you will take what little faith you have and place it in him, then the mulberry tree can be uprooted and planted in the sea, which is impossible. Because with him, the impossible becomes possible. Oh, I realize there's a lot to forgiveness. I'm not trying to be trivial with it this morning at all. And there's a whole series that we could preach to you on that process of forgiveness within your life. But I think this parable takes all the things that we would like to place in an optional category, and it removes the optional from that. And it says, this is the style of life that God has called us to. This is it. That we are his servants in loving obligation to him as our Lord. And as much as we would like to rewrite the scriptures and change things, you cannot get away from that. So can I pray with you for a moment? Because we have a lot to pray about today for sure. So if you would take a posture of prayer, however that looks for you this morning, and just let me pray with you and pray for you for a moment. So Father, as you knew your disciples' heart that day, when you exposed their faith for what it was, as mustard seed faith, you know our hearts as well. God, we may can fool some people, and we may can place a front on at times But God, that is impossible for us to mislead you because you know us. You're God. So, Father, may we, through the work of the Holy Spirit this morning, allow you to deal with these areas of our life that need to be dealt with. God, for us to surrender the thought that we cannot live the life that you've called us to live. We know today is a lie of the enemy, because you have given us great context in how to live that life pleasing to you as we place our weak faith in you, Lord. That we understand today, God, that you owe us nothing, that everything in this life comes at your hand of mercy and grace, God. We are not your employee, we are your servant. We trust you, God. We trust you in these areas of influence and unforgiveness, these areas in our life that are huge struggles for us. That as we place our faith in you, God, that you will do the impossible. Thank you, Lord. We resign the belief that there are things that you have called us to that are optional for our life. And we embrace the truth that these things are our duty and our obligation through your love in our life. We surrender that to you, Lord. In your name. Hey, thanks for joining us today and spending this time with us. Before you leave, would you take a moment to subscribe to our YouTube channel or go on Facebook and comment there so that more people have the opportunity to hear this message. Also, if you'd like to further engage, go to our website at hopeandanderson.com and subscribe to our newsletter as well. We'd love to see you on campus sometime. Our services are at 9 and 11 a.m., and we would love to have you here in person. So again, thanks for your time, and have a great day.